during the middle of the summer when we're focused on our garden, growing, harvest, pests, fertilization, all of those things that require so much attention, we often forget that we've got many months left to have a garden if we choose. The problem is we often don't think about it until it's too late. Hi, I'm GardenerScott, a master gardener who discusses everything gardening so that you can become a better gardener. And today, let's talk about planning for a fall garden. If you plan it right, a fall garden may end up being the most productive one you grow during the season. I have other videos where I talk about succession planting, the idea that after one harvest is done and the plant is spent, you put more plants in and you have a whole nother season with new plants. And I have another video in this series where I explain why you should have a fall garden that includes better weather, cheaper costs, and the ability to have better tasting harvests. Well, in this video, I'm going to talk about how to get to that point, how to get those tasty root vegetables, the greens, the brassicas, all of the plants that may be struggling during the heat of summer, but really come into their prime in the cool days of fall. As we begin planning our fall garden, there's a very important date on the calendar that you need to be aware of. And that's the average first frost date for your garden. And I'll put a couple links below of how you can find your average first frost date. This is important because, as we know, summer doesn't last forever. At some point, the days are going to get cooler, the nights are going to get cold, and the plants that we're growing into the fall need to be ready for that cold weather. And that's how we begin our planning, is by identifying what that first frost date is, and then working backwards to determine when we get our beds ready, when we put our seeds in, and what plants we can even choose. Planning a fall garden starts at about 12 to 15 weeks before that average first frost date. So I used to do this on a paper calendar where I would identify my average first frost date, which for me is in the middle of October. And then on the calendar, I would mark back every week to identify some of the important consideration points. And I'll be sharing those with you in just a few moments. The 15-week prior point is when I actually sit down and start putting the plan together. And that's what this video is for. Hopefully catching you at about the 15-week point or even earlier. Because the 12 to 14-week point is what we're really looking at when it comes to considering what plants we're going to start and when we're going to start them. Generally speaking, we want to pick plants that will be able to start growing, reach maturity, and then reach the point of harvest within that 12 to 14 week window. We're assuming that that first frost date is going to be the point that some of these plants are going to stop growing or stop producing. And that's often the case. But as you'll see in just a little bit, that's not true for all plants. If you choose wisely, you can have plants that will actually extend quite a ways past that average first frost date. I said I used to do this on the paper calendar. Now I do exactly the same thing, but I do it on my computer. In my calendar program, I identify my average first frost date, and then I just count backwards using the calendar on the computer to determine how many weeks prior I need to think about putting my plants in the ground. And I like to use the seeds that I already have. So I went ahead and pulled out my great store of seeds and decided to pick some that I thought I would put into my fall garden this year. And as I choose the seeds, I'm looking at the package. I'm trying to decide if there's enough time from when I put the seed in the ground or start the seed indoors until I can reach the harvest. So for instance, on this spinach, right on the front it tells me it's 48 days to harvest. That's well within that 12 to 14 week window. As I look at this yellow crookneck, it tells me that it's 60 days. And I've chosen a Swiss chard, I have a watermelon radish, and I have a Napa cabbage, and many more. But all of these can reach harvest within 60 days. And that 60 days is a critical time frame for me. You might be able to have a much longer time frame. Even though my average first frost date comes typically in October, I know from experience that in my region, it's not unusual to get a frost before that point. So instead of using the entire 14-week, I use the 12-week window. So 12 weeks gives me roughly 84 days to start my seeds, grow my plants, and get to harvest, allowing for that possibility of an early frost. So if I pick 60-day plants, I can get everything growing and a harvest and still have a little bit of a buffer of a week or two before the possibility of an early frost. You may have noticed that of these plants that I identified, most of them are what I call cool season plants, or you might call it cool weather plants. It's the plants that can handle some cold. But the crookneck squash can give me a harvest within 60 days. As soon as it is exposed to a frost, it's going to die. So you can still grow some plants like cucumbers and squashes if you choose the right variety and fit it within your critical window. Generally, you'll have better success in a fall garden with those cool season plants. And I'll put a good list in the description below. We're talking about lettuce and spinach and the brassicas, kale, carrots, chard, all of the root vegetables. It's really great opportunity to extend your gardening season. But as much as it's a benefit, there are some things that you need to be aware of. Starting seeds in the summer is great. The soil's warm, the sun's out, but a lot of these cool season plants will actually not germinate if the soil is too warm. If it's hot out, you're not going to get the germination of a lot of the brassicas, the cauliflower, the broccoli, the Brussels sprouts. So for many of these plants, just to give you that little bit extra advantage, it's better to start the seeds indoors. So if you start your broccoli in flats and trays in your house, the soil's going to be much more moderate temperature. It's not going to be exposed to that harsh heat of summer. And then after about 3 weeks, when the plant is growing, it's got true leaves, you harden it off, then you could put it outside. That's a much better way to ensure germination of many of these cool season plants. But the other ones, like the cucumbers, the squashes, it's best to put them directly into the warm soil because that will improve their germination. So let's go ahead and start putting together our calendar. You already know that at the 15-week point, we're putting the plan together and choosing our seeds. At the 12 to 14-week point before the average first frost date, we can actually start putting some seeds into soil. Outside in the garden, you can start sowing beans and the squash and the cucumbers, any of those plants that really like the warm weather but fall within that rough 60 to 72 day harvest window. Go ahead and stick them outside, get them growing. Also, in that 12 to 14 week frame, start those brassicas and other cool season plants indoors. So the broccoli and the cauliflower and the Brussels sprouts and spinach, you can start all those plants indoors ahead of time. Get them growing. And then at the 10 to 12 week time frame, depending on how big the plants are, you can start moving them outside. Transplant all of those indoor plants into a garden that should be cooler. The days won't be as hot. Also, in that 10 to 12 week window, you can start putting in radishes and lettuce and direct sowing some spinach. Start putting in those cool season plants. If you want to grow root crops, the roots like rutabagas that take a long time, start those seeds at that 12 to 14 week point. But the turnips that grow pretty quickly, you can put them in that 10 to 12 week window. During this same 10 to 14 week period is the best time to start thinking about and preparing the beds. Because it doesn't do any good to have all these seeds and start the plants indoors if there's nowhere to put them in your garden. So anticipate when you're going to harvest, when you're going to pull plants, and that will also help you determine when you're going to put some of these seeds and plants in the ground. In this bed, I had some Napa cabbage that bolted and went to seed. I pulled them and added them to my lasagna garden bed, and now I have this space all ready to go to start some of those root vegetables that I'm going to be growing very soon. My first crop of carrots in that bed is ready to harvest. So as I start pulling the carrots and opening up space, I can then allot that space for some of the fall garden plants. If you have an entire bed or a space and you have the time and the willingness, I do advise that you work in some amendments into the soil, like compost and aged manure, because the plants that we're growing here use some of the nutrients. So if you can, amend the soil. It's not critical. You may need to have some fertilizer as you go into the fall. But as part of your planning, you have to bring into account what's growing, when it's going to be gone, and when the space is going to be available for all of these other plants that you're growing into the fall. And if you were lucky enough to actually start the planting at the 15-week point, by the 10-week point, you've already got a lot of plants growing. Don't be concerned if you didn't get an opportunity to start that early. Just back it up. If you don't start your planting till the 14-week point, no problem. If the planting doesn't happen till the 12-week point, no problem. Because 8 to 10 weeks prior to your average first frost date, you can still put more seeds in the ground. You can grow arugala, pak choi, you can do spinach, you can do lettuce, you can do more radishes. Just keep putting plants in the ground. 4 to 6 weeks prior, you can still do spinach and lettuce and radish. At that point, do start thinking about the possibility of an early frost and of protecting your plants when the frost hits. So about 4 to 6 weeks before that frost, put some hoops over your beds and start cutting some plastic. So when that frost date comes, you're ready to cover your plants and get a little bit extra protection, a few extra degrees at night. And some of those more tender plants will just shrug off that first frost as though nothing happened. You will need to modify some of your gardening practices when you start seeds in the summer and then grow into the fall. The seeds need to germinate, and that critical 1/4 to 1/2 inch of soil at the surface is going to dry out in the hot sun. So expect that you're going to have to water multiple times during the day just to keep the soil moist so that those seeds can germinate. One thing you can do is spread a light mulch. So in this bed that's ready for seeds, I have a light layer of straw mulch. That reduces my watering by about half, but I still have to do it multiple times. As the plants grow, they're actually going to need less water. The cooler days will have less evaporation. So whereas in the summer you might have had to water at least once every day, moving forward into the fall, you may only have to water once every 2 or 3 days. Be sure you're checking the soil moisture so that you don't overwater, a very common mistake in fall gardening. And another reason to use mulch as the plants grow is to help moderate the soil temperature. It's going to be warm during the day and then cooling off at night. Well, the mulch acts as a blanket to keep the soil at a more moderate and a more even temperature. So, adjust your watering as needed and definitely use mulch from the time that the seeds are started until the plants are full grown. Don't be intimidated by the idea that a fall garden requires a lot of extra planning and modification of your normal gardening practices. It's very easy. You just need to be aware that things are different from a summer garden to a fall garden. Once you are aware of those differences, the rest just happens. It's extremely easy, and then you get to enjoy the wonderful harvest, because isn't that why we're all doing this? I actually start the planting of my fall garden well early in the year. When I'm ordering my seeds in January and February, I'm doing so with the fall garden in mind. So if by some chance you missed a fall garden this year, start thinking about it next year, and start thinking about it very early so you don't miss out. And if you did happen to miss the first video where I explained why you should have a fall garden, well, you can watch it and this one right here. Just click on the link. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.